The Adventures of a Newcomer. If you enjoy hearing these readings, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube or share with a friend. Thanks so much. Chapter 7. Ethelred in the Frying Pan. When Ethelred entered the yard, it was deserted. He shivered, for the change from the warm, comfortable gymnasium to the northerly breeze without is likely to be appreciated by one who has just come forth from a boxing contest. Under other circumstances, he might have been tempted to return, but just now he wanted a little solitude, for he was beginning to fancy that the boys had been playing upon him. However, he was not dismayed. His turn was to come yet, as he had intimated publicly on several distinct occasions. He would teach these college boys that he could not be imposed upon. While walking up and down the yard, he counted his money. $2.85, he said. That's good for a beginning. I'll have $10 by tomorrow noon. Returning the money to his pocket, he walked towards the end of the yard, which gave a view of the senior division's playgrounds. 10 or 12 large boys were standing at the boundaries nearest him. They returned his survey with considerable interest, and held a whispered consultation. Ethelred, after gazing at the group for a moment, thought well to step over and have a talk. "Look-a-here," he began. "I notice that some of you chaps ain't any bigger than me. How is it that you fellows are in the big yard and me in the little?" "Professor Salvini," said the smallest student in the group, as he turned towards a serious-faced young man with a slight mustache. "Perhaps you can explain this. Are you aware that this newcomer has been put in the small yard?" The person addressed as Professor Salvini was Edward Land, a student of philosophy. He combined the dignity of professor with a student's love of fun. Stroking his mustache and eyeing Ethelred very sternly, he said in a solemn baritone, "Your name, my son?" "Ethelred Preston." "How long is it since you were born?" "Excuse me, Professor," put in the first speaker. "I wish to call Professor Pattersole." And before turning upon his heel, he raised his hat with great reverence. "I'm nearly 16, if that's what you mean," answered Ethelred, relapsing into the smile which had unnerved the president. "See here, don't laugh unless I tell you. Have you got your baptismal certificate about you?" "No," answered Ethelred, whose face was now very grave. "Well, let that pass. What's your name?" "Ethelred Preston." "Let me see," mused Professor Salvini, taking out a notebook. "Oh, yes. You came here today. The president received you, I believe, who told you to go into the junior division. The president and the vice president both." "There!" exclaimed the professor with much vehemence, addressing the solemn and attentive crowd about him. "Those two are always interfering with my authority. Ethelred Preston, why didn't you come to me?" I didn't know." "But you should have known, sir. Ah, here comes Professor Pattersole. I shall have to confer with him." Accompanied by the boy who had recently left the group, there now approached a tall, thin, cadaverous young man who could not have been more than 20. His face was very serious and solemn. As he came near, all the boys raised their hats. "We can never have perfect discipline in this college," he said in strong, resolute tones, "till the president and vice president learn their places. Where is the newcomer?" "Here he is, sir." "This is the fellow, sir," came the chorus from the bystanders. Professor Pattersole folded his arms, threw his head back, and said, "Let him be presented." "Professor Pattersole," said Professor Salvini, "allow me to introduce you to Ethelred Stampson." "It's Preston, sir," suggested one of the group. "That," returned Professor Salvini, "remains to be proved." As the boy had no baptismal record, and as On the other hand, the difference between pressed on and stamped on is practically nothing, at least from the point of view of a football player. I shall stick to my first introduction and repeat Professor Pattersall. Allow me to introduce you to Ethelred Stampson. With his head still high in the air, his arms folded, and Professor looked down from his lofty heights upon Ethelred. Ethelred looked up and grinned. "Take off your hat, sir," roared Professor Pattersall. "Never dare to look me in the eye with your hat on. What business," he continued, when Ethelred had removed his hat, "have you over in the junior division?" "I was sent there by the president and vice president." "Say 'sir' when you address me," commanded Professor Pattersall. "The manners of the rising generation are simply deplorable." Some members of the group were beginning to snicker. "Boys," continued Professor Pattersall, "what do you mean by standing round when I am conducting an examination? Get away with you at once." The students' address had nothing for it but to go away. They went very willingly. "And I say, James Ellis," cried out the professor to one of the last in the group, "I'll hear you 100 lines of memory lessons after I have done with this young man. Smoking on the sly must stop in this college." Now James Ellis was a member of the graduating class, prefect of the sodality, and a student who had never received lines since his entrance at the college, whereas the young man who for the time being was addressed as Professor Pattersall had just been called away from the memorizing of lines to attend to Ethelred. The professor's remarks to Ellis were too much for the departing crowd, and if Ethelred had not been dazed by Pattersall's magnificent assumption of authority, he might have perceived that he was being made the victim of a new practical joke. Professor Pattersall resumed Professor Salvini. "Don't you think your young friend should be placed in the senior division?" "Assuredly. Write out an order on the president to the effect while I question the youth further." "Boy, in what class were you placed?" "In the 3rd commercial." "Put on your hat, my son. The weather is a trifle keen. But think of your being put in the 3rd commercial. Who examined you?" "Father Howard." "Absurd," put in Professor Salvini. "You must discharge Father Howard, and I'm beginning to fear that the president must go too." "How much time did he spend in examining you?" resumed Professor Pattersall. "About 10 minutes." "Monstrance! Why doesn't the vice president attend to his own business, which he doesn't know, and send boys to be examined to me? He should have taken at least 4 hours." Professor Salvini, notebook in hand, continued to write industriously. The senior playground, while this conversation was going on, had almost suddenly become alive with boys, who were all walking up and down in groups of 2 and 3. These various groups contrived to pass at short intervals the trio, from the professors and Ethelred down to the liveliest boy upon the grounds. There was not a single one whose face, so long at least as its owner was within sight and hearing of Ethelred, was not set in unutterable gravity. "Now, boy," resumed Pattersall, "follow us to the senior study hall, and be careful on the way thither to observe that gravity of deportment which you see on the faces of the students around you. A gravity, I may add, which speaks well for the habit of self-control contracted by the severe training of our college curriculum." Taking the thoroughly mystified Ethelred by the hand, Professor Pattersall walked gravely towards the student hall, exhorting the newcomer in a loud voice, the while to be extremely careful in the choice of his friends, and to apply himself from the outset with the diligence to his studies, while Professor Salvini hurried on before them to give warning to the students who might happen to be in the study hall. When the unhappy pupil and his mentor entered, there were 14 or 15 of the seniors at their desks. All of them turned to gaze upon Ethelred. On half-holidays, the members of the senior division were allowed the privilege of the study room, with the understanding that there was to be no loud talking or boisterous conduct. Professor Pattersole, having conducted Ethelred to a seat near the door, handed him a copy of Cicero. The most important qualification in a young student, he observed, is ability to memorize. Here you have Cicero's celebrated oration, Pro Marcello, the opening sentence of which our giddier pupils love to sing to the air of Home Sweet Home. You will now take the first 100 lines of this celebrated oration and memorize it within an hour's time. "But I don't know Latin," whispered Ethelred. "I can't learn that stuff." "To learn Latin, the less you know about it, the better. Before you begin, I desire to give you a few instructions. First of all, you are to be promoted to the large yard tonight, not before. When the recess begins after the second hour of studies, you will slip over from the junior division to the place where you had the high honor of first making my acquaintance. Do you understand?" "Yes." At this answer, Professor Pattersole's face grew black. "Yes, sir." "That's better, though you might have said yes, Professor. In the meantime, you must tell none of the small boys that you are coming over to this side. They might become jealous. After you have learned your memory lesson, you will return to the small boys and play with them, and eat with them, and spend your 2 hours of study in their hall. Now go to work at your memory lesson, and don't you dare to raise your head from your book till I give the sign." And then Professor Pattersole paraded up and down the aisles with the airs, much exaggerated, of a bona fide professor, while Ethelred gazed helplessly upon the book, while the hall quietly filled with students, while the silence was such that the slightest sound disturbed it. If Ethelred had but looked around and gazed upon these silent students, he would doubtless have been puzzled by their facial expressions. Most of them, all a grin, were eyeing him uninterruptedly. Some red-faced and quivering, were struggling manfully against the temptation to laugh aloud, and occasionally one or the other of them would rush from the hall and give vent to his emotions outside. Professor Pattersole's face, in the meantime, never for a moment relaxed from its austere gravity. Something over a quarter of an hour had gone by when a student came in rather hurriedly and whispered a few words in Professor Pattersole's ear, whereupon, forgetting his decorum, the self-appointed study-keeper hurried over to Ethelred. "Boy," he said, "slip back to your yard at once, or our plans for bringing you into this division tonight will be spoiled. Slip out by this door, and be sure not to breathe a syllable to anyone. I excuse you from your memory lesson." Ethelred, nothing loath, took his leave. The professor followed him by the same door, and his tall form had hardly disappeared when there entered from the opposite entrance the prefect of the division. To find 120 boys out of possible 150 in perfect silence and at their books was something so astonishing that the prefect gave a little start, while his face expressed sincere astonishment. The boys could hold in no longer. A rich wave of genuine and uncontrollable laughter rolled through the hall. The prefect at once understood that something out of the ordinary had been going on. He waited quietly till the laughter had subsided, and then smilingly rapped with his keys on the door for all to leave. Immediately, once they were outside the study hall, there formed a group about him to tell him of Professor Pattersole and the newcomer. They told the whole story with such evident enjoyment, taking care to inform the prefect that the boy had defied anyone to take him in, and that Mr. Evans relished the joke almost as much as the narrators. I said that they told the whole story. This is not quite correct. They failed to mention that at last recess after night studies, Ethelred was to be transferred to the senior division. Perhaps they forgot to mention it. Chapter 8, in which Ed Devereux proposes to help Ethelred run away. Shortly after Ethelred's departure from the gymnasium, Earl asked Eddie Devereux to take a walk with him outside. Ed, he began, when they had gone in silence halfway across the yard, I feel pretty bad. About Mr. Gade? Not exactly. I feel bad about that too, or rather angry. It seems to me that Mr. Gade has been very harsh and unjust. Well, you know, Earl, you haven't been at all up in your lessons for 2 or 3 weeks, and up to this you never missed. All the boys have noticed it. Well, there are some things a boy can't talk about, Ed. But I want to tell you that I've honestly tried to study lately, but it has been so hard. Up to the retreat, I found study so easy, but somehow since then my mind goes wool-gathering all the time. I wish you'd pray for me, Eddie. Today I've felt as if I were in danger of going wrong. I actually hate Mr. Gade, and I know that I'm just full of spite. I didn't think I was that kind of a boy. You're not, Earl. This trouble with Mr. Gade will blow over in a couple of days, and you'll be the same as ever. I'm afraid not. And today I said something that has bothered me ever since. I told the newcomer that this place was jail. That was disloyal to our college. I've always been treated well here, and I've had a pretty cheerful time of it. And now the very first time a newcomer is put in my charge, I begin by running the place down. A good many fellows say things like that about the place, Earl, and some of them really mean it, too. Is that what bothers you? That's not it at all. I had a chance to take back what I said, but I was too mulish or too weak to do it. And then the boy said that he wasn't going to stay in a jail, and that he'd run away tomorrow night. You see, in all probability, I've put it into his head to run away. But you can stop that if you want to. No, I promise not to interfere. What's worse, I've lent him money to go away. With serious brow, Eddie reflected for some moments. Presently, he broke into a grin. Good gracious, it's just the thing. Look here, Earl. That fellow has no business at this college. His mother may be a lady, as you say, but he certainly is a street boy. I'm just as sure as can be that he stays here for a week, he will be dismissed or expelled. If you and I were to tell the vice president what we know about him, Ethelred would go by the train tonight. Of course, we don't like to go reporting on fellows, unless it is really necessary. Now, instead of that, suppose we help him to run away. What? Cried Earl. Yeah, why not? If the president knew the kind of boy he was, he'd acknowledge that we were doing the college a real service. Now look, we've got to do one thing or the other. Report Ethelred as being unfit to go with the boys here, or help him run away. Don't you think we could help him? It doesn't seem wrong in this case because the president would want him to go too, if he knew as much about him as we do. And besides, here Ed's eyes glittered, there'll be a lot of fun. But, objected Earl, the boy may not be able to take care of himself. You know his father is in Europe and his mother is on the way there too. If anything were to happen to him, I should feel responsible. Again Ed fell into thought. That's so, he asserted. Can't we get over that difficulty? Of course, it would be wrong to help the fellow off if we didn't know he'd be cared for when he got away. I wish we could see our way out of that. I remember now, said Earl, that he said he had lots of friends. Did he? Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll find out whether he will go back to people who have a right to care for him, and if he will, then we'll do a good act of helping him off." "It will be a good thing for the boys here, certainly," said Earl. "Yes, and it will do no harm to anyone else. There's not a boy in our yard, as far as I know, who has the least temptation to run away, so there won't be any scandal in the case. They will look upon it as being about the sort of thing which they might expect from a boy like that darling." "What has become of him, I wonder?" "He left the playroom some time ago, and he certainly is not in the yard." Eddie chuckled. "I'm willing to bet that he has fallen into the hands of the big boys. I think they've heard about him already. Our refectory reader had a chance to give the reader in the big boys' refectory a few points on the newcomer at second table." Eddie had rightly guessed the fact, though the case he assigned was defective. It is true the small boy reader had given his senior conferor an account of Ethelred, but besides this, every student in the senior division had heard and canvassed Ethelred's remarks in the greenness of the students. The large boys, by tact agreement, had resolved to show Ethelred that, along with the simplicity of a dove which distinguished the boarders of Henryton College, there was also the cunning of a few serpents. The students of Henryton were, as a rule, kind and considerate in their dealings with newcomers. However, if a boy during the first days of his arrival proved himself to be somewhat forward, or plumed himself upon his superior knowledge of life, or gave evidence of being annoying, conceited, they were not slow in devising plans to bring him to a sense of his position. On rare occasions, moreover, they imposed upon a newcomer for no other reason than a love of harmless fun. Earl and Eddie were still talking of the new arrival when that worthy came running round the corner of the classroom building. "Hey there, darling! We've been out of bounds," called Ed. Ethelred looked round to see whether any others had noticed his return, and then joined the two boys. "What were you doing in the large yard?" asked Ed. With a knowing look, Ethelred put his finger under his right eye and pressed down upon his cheek, so as to give the two boys a good view of that organ. "Do you see my green in my eye?" "Oh, if you don't care to talk, all right. I was going to ask you whether they had showed you the tree next to the one which George Washington cut with his little hatchet." "You think you're smart," snarled the darling. "But I'm going to show you a point or two before I go tomorrow night." "Go where?" "Anywhere from here. Say, can't you lend a fellow a few dollars? I don't want to go away without I have some money." "See here, Ethelred Preston," put in Earl, "we don't help you to run away unless we know that you're going home. The old my mother has gone to Europe." "Then we'll not let you run away. You have no right to leave this college unless you have a fixed home and someone to take care of you." "What business is it of yours?" cried Ethelred angrily. He had doubled up his fists as though he were about to attack Earl. "I'm going to make it my business. It was my fault, for all I know, that you got it into your head to run away. But if you get away, it will be my fault too." "I'd like to know who'll stop me," roared the darling. "I will," answered Earl quietly. The two boys, as they stood facing each other, formed a striking contrast. Ethelred, blustering, passionate, nosy; Earl, quiet, cool, determined. Earl's eyes, as he said "I will," fell full upon Ethelred's. The latter bore the gaze for a moment, and then turned his head away. A moment before, Ethelred had mentally resolved to fight Earl in that mutual gaze. The fight had taken place, and Ethelred was worsted. Since you fellows meddled so confoundedly, I don't mind telling you that my mother put me in charge of Mr. Dodge, the mayor of Brighton, and told me that if I didn't like this college, after a day or so, I might go away and stay with him." "Oh," cried Eddie, greatly relieved, "that makes things better." "But," objected Earl, "why don't you go to the president of the college like a man, and tell him you have permission from your mother to leave?" "Because," answered Ethelred, after a pause, "I've lost the letter she gave me to the president. In that there letter she told him to let me go any time I wanted to." Eddie Devereux grinned. "You compose nicely," he said. "If I was to go to the president," pursued Ethelred, who failed to perceive the point of Eddie's remark, "and asked him to let me go, he'd have to write to the mayor and wait for an answer, and I'd have to stay here for 2 or 3 days longer. That would be very hard on you, and some of us, too, wouldn't it?" said Eddie. "Well," he continued, "I, for one, am willing to help you, if you'll give your solemn promise to go back to your guardian." "I'll swear it. I'll take an oath." Here Ethelred actually began to swear that he would return directly to his guardian, but Earl cut him short. "All we want is your word of honor." Ethelred gave his word of honor in 5 or 6 variations, like many people who set little value on their word. He was almost eloquent, and facile in promising and in attesting to the truth of his own statements. "Here's 75 cents, said Eddie. "You needn't pay it back until you come back again." Ethelred's manner changed at once. He was now fawning. Money seemed to be the one thing upon which he set value. Earl and Eddie exchanged looks of disgust as the darling cringed before them. Earl was strongly tempted to leave the sordid newcomer and have nothing more to do with him. He was a noble character, and could neither understand nor enjoy such an exhibition of vulgarity. Eddie, on the other hand, had a keen sense of fun. Under all the vulgarity, he saw great promise of future frolic. "Have you made up your mind as to which way you'll get out?" he asked. "Not yet, Eddie." "Why not drop over the wall? It's only 30 feet or so to the side end of that yard." "Think I want to break my legs?" "That's so. A runaway with broken legs would be a—" Eddie paused for the phrase. "A contradiction in terms," supplied Earl. "We might have 3 or 4 fellows below to hold a net to catch you in, the way they do in a circus," Eddie went on. "No, you don't," said the darling. As they spoke, they had walked over to the wall. "It would be a bad plan, though. Only the great trouble would be that we'd have to get the 4 fellows out there to catch you. Oh, I declare, there's just the place. You see this place here? There are a few stones on top loose. We can take them out easily, and we'll let down a rope and hold it till you're down in the street. You can climb down the rope, can't you?" "Yes, I suppose so." "Of course you can. And if your muscle gives out, you can twine your legs round the rope and slide down. We can hitch the end of the rope to that tree over there, and Earl and I and Haynes will hold it besides. Of course, we won't tell the other fellows about it, but we must have a 3rd person to hold the rope, and Haynes will be that very best." "Where are you going to get the rope?" asked Ethelred. "Oh, there will be no trouble about that. We've got a tremendous coil of rope in the gymnasium, and I'll see to that myself. Now the question is, when do you intend to go?" "Tomorrow night, so as to catch the train." "Very good. After 2nd hour's studies, there are 25 minutes to spare, and we can do it easily. It will be dark then, and I'll have the rope here. We'll all come over, Earl, you and Haynes and myself, from different parts of the yard, so as to not attract attention. But maybe I'll be put in the big yard tomorrow, Eddie gave Earl a quick side look. As he did so, there was a world of merriment in his eye, for he divined from Ethelred's remark the senior students, too, had the hapless newcomer in hand. "No matter," he said, turning with a perfectly serious face to Ethelred. "You can slip over here just the same. We'll tie the rope in a jiffy, and over you go." "All right, but I need more money." "No, you don't. It's only 60 miles or so to Brighton." "Yes, but I want to take a sleeper too, and that costs money." "How much money have you?" "Only $1.50, so help me." "That's not true," cried Earl. "I'll swear." "Hold on," interposed Earl. "You needn't lie about it. You've been imposing on some of the little boys here, and have got $1 or $2 out of them. We all know about it." Ethelred was silent. "And we want you to let them alone after this. If we catch you borrowing any more money, we'll let you take care of yourself. And we'll see besides that you pay up before you go." "I intend to pay back every cent," protested Ethelred. "So much the better." "Well, remember tomorrow night. There come the boys for a game of football. Did you ever see a game?" "No." "Come on, then. I'll explain it to you as you look on." For the rest of that afternoon, Ethelred, under Earl's care, met with no misadventure.